Gunpowder leaves a metallic, sour taste in the back of your throat, but high society tastes like stale champagne and expensive boredom. Leo hated both. He sat at a corner table in a Michelin-starred restaurant, wearing a $5,000 suit, pretending to be a man named Tommy, a favor for an idiot friend. He expected an hour of agonizing small talk. He didn't expect the heavy, stinging scent of industrial lemon bleach, or the exhausted woman kneeling on the cold marble floor, holding a scrub brush like a weapon. Silverware clinked against fine china, a sharp, repetitive sound that drilled directly into the base of Leo's skull. The dining room of L'Oreal was a masterclass in aggressive subtlety, dim, amber lighting designed to hide wrinkles, thick velvet curtains meant to swallow the sounds of the city outside. To anyone else, it was a sanctuary of wealth. To Leo Castiglione, it felt like a velvet-lined coffin. He shifted his weight, the heavy wool of his bespoke suit pulling uncomfortably across his broad shoulders. His tailored collar felt tight, hot. He ran a thick finger inside the rim, trying to let in air that smelled of roasted truffles and melting wax. Across the table sat Abigail Preston. She was currently dissecting her sea bass with the precision of a surgeon, though her mouth hadn't stopped moving since the waiter poured the first glass of Barolo. She smelled of a floral perfume so overwhelming it made Leo's eyes water. Something cloying, like crushed lilies left in the sun too long. And I told him, I simply cannot do the Hamptons in August, Abigail said, her manicured fingers fluttering in the air. Her nails were painted a glossy, perfect nude. It's practically a zoo. Don't you agree, Tommy? Leo blinked, pulling himself back from the exits. He had spent the last 20 minutes instinctively mapping the room. 2 doors to the kitchen, 1 main entrance, a narrow hallway leading to the restrooms, 4 waiters who looked entirely too soft to be carrying concealed weapons, and 1 sommelier who walked with a slight limp, an old knee injury, not a holster issue. Paranoia wasn't a choice for Leo anymore. It was an operating system. Yeah, Leo muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that didn't fit the elegant surroundings. A zoo. He wasn't Tommy. Tommy Rossi was currently sitting in a heavily fortified penthouse across town, sweating through a panic attack. Tommy had met Abigail online, got cold feet, and became convinced she was a rival family's plant, sent to honey trap him. Tommy was a neurotic mess, but he was also the only man who had pulled Leo out of a burning sedan 3 years ago. You don't ignore a debt like that, even if paying it back means enduring an hour of high society torture. Just scope her out, Leo, Tommy had begged, pacing the Persian rug. Buy me a drink, ask her a few questions, make sure she isn't carrying a wire or hiding a stiletto in her boot. Leo took a slow, measured sip of his water. The condensation on the crystal glass dampened his calloused fingertips. He looked at Abigail. She wasn't an assassin. She was just annoying. You're very quiet, Abigail noted, tilting her head. The candlelight caught the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. It flashed, a sharp, cold glint. Your profile said you were in logistics? Import, export, Leo lied smoothly, leaning back in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight. Moving things from point A to point B. Fascinating, she said, though her eyes were already drifting toward a minor celebrity, sitting 3 tables over. Leo felt a deep, hollow exhaustion settle in his chest. His life was a constant, grinding machine of violence, territory disputes, and cold calculations. He dealt with men who communicated in threats and blood. Sitting here, listening to a woman complain about summer homes and Pilates instructors, felt absurd. He didn't belong in this world of manufactured problems any more than he belonged in his own world of genuine nightmares. He existed in a permanent state of tension, a coiled spring waiting to snap. "Excuse me," Leo said abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a harsh, unrefined noise that drew a disapproving glance from the sommelier. "I need to use the restroom." Abigail blinked, her fork hovering in midair. "Oh." "Of course." Leo didn't wait for her to say anything else. He turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He just needed a minute. 60 seconds of silence to scrub the scent of lilies from his nose before he went back, finished the charade, and told Tommy he was a paranoid idiot. He pushed through the heavy oak door that led to the service corridor, expecting the quiet, sterile environment of high-end restaurant bathrooms. Instead, the heavy oak door swung shut behind him, cutting off the soft jazz of the dining room, replacing it with the low, mechanical hum of an ice machine and the sharp squeak of rubber on wet tile. The hallway was narrow, walled with practical beige tile that offered zero pretense of luxury. The air here was drastically different. Gone was the truffle oil and melted wax. Here, the air was aggressive. It smelled of industrial-grade ammonia, artificial lemon, and the faint, metallic tang of dirty mop water. It was an ugly, honest smell. Leo stopped. A few feet away, blocking the path to the men's room, was a woman on her hands and knees. A busboy must have dropped a tray. Shattered glass lay swept into a neat pile against the baseboard, but a massive dark stain, probably a very expensive Cabernet, had splashed against the lower wall and pooled on the grout. The woman was attacking it. She wore a dark blue uniform, the cheap polyester fabric stretched tight across her back as she leaned into her work. A heavy yellow bucket sat beside her, water sloshing against the plastic rim. Leo stood in silence, watching her. He didn't know why he didn't clear his throat. He just watched the frantic, rigid motion of her shoulder as she scrubbed a bristled brush into the tile. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound was abrasive, rhythmic. She paused, sitting back on her heels, and wiped the back of her wrist across her forehead. A loose strand of mousy brown hair had escaped the messy, utilitarian bun at the nape of her neck, sticking to her damp skin. She let out a long, ragged exhale. It wasn't a delicate sigh. It was the heavy, rattling breath of someone who had been on their feet for 10 hours. Leo took a step forward. The leather sole of his shoe scuffed against the dry portion of the tile. The woman's head snapped up. She didn't look at his face first. Her eyes immediately darted to his shoes, custom Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. Leo watched her jaw tighten. A flash of pure, unfiltered irritation crossed her features. She wasn't intimidated by the expensive suit or the broad, looming figure of a man who routinely made other men cross the street to avoid him. She was annoyed that he was near her wet floor. "Watch the puddle, buddy," she said. Her voice was slightly raspy, lacking any customer service sweetness. It was flat and tired. Leo froze. Buddy. Nobody had called him Buddy in 15 years. Usually it was Mr. Castiglione, sir, followed by a nervous swallow. He finally looked at her face. It wasn't a face that belonged in this restaurant. She had sharp cheekbones, but there were deep, bruised-looking shadows under her eyes. Her skin was pale, stripped of makeup, shiny with exertion. She wasn't beautiful in the way Abigail was beautiful. There was nothing manufactured or polished about her. But she was real, dangerously real. "Sorry," Leo said. The word felt strange in his mouth. Clunky. "Just step to the left," she ordered, turning her attention back to the red stain. She plunged a grey, ragged cloth into the yellow bucket, wrung it out with violent efficiency, and slapped it against the tile. The harsh smell of bleach flared up again. Leo didn't step to the left. He looked at her hands. They were raw, the knuckles cracked and red from hot water and chemicals. Her fingernails were clipped completely flat. On the side of her right thumb, he noticed an old, jagged burn scar. It was a working hand, a survivor's hand. Without thinking, Leo crouched down. His $5,000 slacks pulled tight against his thighs, the fabric resting perilously close to the dirty mop water. The woman paused again, the wet rag hovering over the tile. She looked at him, her brow furrowing in deep suspicion. Up close, her eyes were a startling shade of hazel, mostly green, flecked with angry gold. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into defensive territory. She shifted her weight back slightly, her grip on the scrub brush tightening. "That's wine," Leo said, his voice low. He pointed to the stain. "Ammonia won't pull the tannins out of the grout. You need club soda and salt to lift it, or it'll set pink." Caris Torres stared at the massive man crouching beside her mop bucket. He smelled like expensive cologne, cedarwood and black pepper, but there was something dark and heavy in his eyes. He looked like a mobster from a movie, all sharp jawline and broken nose, stuffed into a banker's suit. "Oh, right," Caris said, her tone dripping with dry sarcasm. "Let me just casually ask the bartender for his finest club soda so I can perform a chemistry experiment on the floor. Or I can scrub it with the bleach they actually pay for until my arm falls off, because my shift ended 20 minutes ago, and I want to go home." Leo felt a strange jolt in his chest. It wasn't a flutter of romance. It was the sharp, jagged hook of recognition. She was exhausted. She was trapped in a miserable situation, doing what she had to do to survive, completely devoid of illusions. He knew that exact feeling. He lived it every day, just on a different, bloodier scale. "I can get the soda," Leo said, half rising. "Don't!" Caris snapped. She let out another heavy breath, dropping the rag into the bucket. It landed with a dull splash. "Don't do me any favors, Suit. Just step around the puddle and go to the bathroom. The faster you leave, the faster I can pretend this floor is clean." She grabbed the handle of the brush and leaned forward, dismissing him entirely. Leo stood up slowly. He looked down at the crown of her head, at the damp strands of hair, at the rigid line of her spine. He should walk away. He was a dangerous man standing in a hallway over a spilled glass of wine, wasting time. But as he stepped around the puddle and pushed through the men's room door, the image of her raw, cracked knuckles burned behind his eyelids. When Leo returned to the table, Abigail was eating her salad. "Is everything all right, Tommy?" she asked, delicately dabbing the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. "You were gone a while." "Fine," Leo grunted. He sat down heavily. The leather chair no longer felt like a velvet coffin. It felt like a joke. He stared at Abigail. He looked at her perfectly smooth, unblemished hands. He looked at the perfectly styled curls framing her face, held in place by expensive spray. She was a ghost, a hologram of a person. "Don't do me any favors, Suit." The raspy, tired voice echoed in his head, cutting through the low murmur of the restaurant like a siren. Leo's chest felt tight. A strange, chaotic energy bubbled in his veins. He had spent his entire adult life controlling his impulses, making cold, rational decisions to keep his family empire from crumbling. He didn't do erratic. He didn't do impulsive. But he couldn't stop looking toward the heavy oak door leading to the service corridor. "Tommy, are you listening to me?" Abigail asked, a hint of genuine annoyance cracking her polite veneer. "No," Leo said. Abigail blinked, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows shooting up. "Excuse me?" "I said no. I'm not listening." Leo reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek, black leather money clip. He peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills and dropped them onto the white tablecloth. They landed beside the breadbasket with a soft, final thud. "What is this?" Abigail demanded, her voice rising slightly, drawing the attention of the table next to them. "It's over," Leo said. He didn't try to soften his voice. He didn't try to be Tommy anymore. The low, dangerous rumble of his true cadence slipped out. "Tommy isn't for you. You aren't for him. Enjoy the sea bass." He stood up, buttoning his jacket with a single, fluid motion. He didn't wait for her to sputter an outraged reply. He turned his back on her and walked away. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a heavy, rhythmic thud. He felt like a lunatic. What was he doing? He was a capo, a boss. He had a meeting at midnight to discuss a shipment of stolen weapons at the docks, and yet his boots were carrying him directly back toward the smell of industrial bleach. He pushed through the oak door again. The hallway was empty. The floor was drying, a faint, pink shadow lingering on the grout. The yellow bucket was gone. Panic, sharp and completely irrational, spiked in Leo's chest. He walked faster, his long strides eating up the distance down the corridor. He bypassed the bathrooms, pushing through a set of swinging metal doors that led into the back-of-house chaos. The kitchen was a war zone of shouting chefs, clattering pans, and the intense heat of open flames. Leo ignored the surprised yells of a sous chef, weaving through the stainless steel prep stations like a shark cutting through water. He scanned the room, his eyes darting past the white coats, looking for the dark blue polyester uniform. He found her by the service elevator near the loading dock. Karis had her coat on, a thin, olive-green parka that looked about 3 years past its prime. She was untying the messy bun, letting her dull brown hair fall around her shoulders. She looked even smaller, standing next to the massive steel elevator doors. "Hey," Leo called out. His voice was louder than he intended, echoing off the concrete walls of the loading bay. Karis jumped, spinning around. When she saw him, her eyes narrowed instantly. She pulled the edges of her cheap parka tighter around her chest, a purely defensive gesture. "You again?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Did you get lost on the way to valet parking, or do you make a habit of stalking the janitorial staff?" Leo stopped a few feet away from her. The cool night air drafted in from the loading dock, carrying the smell of city smog and damp asphalt, completely wiping away the kitchen grease. He didn't know what to say. For a man who regularly negotiated millions of dollars with a single glare, he felt entirely stripped of his armor. He looked at her face, reading the exhaustion, the deep-seated wariness. She was looking at him like he was a threat. And he was. Just not the kind she thought. "I didn't get lost," Leo said. His hands flexed at his sides. He forcefully shoved them into his pockets to stop himself from reaching out. "I left my date." Karis stared at him. She looked at the $5,000 suit, then up at his scarred, brutally hardened face. She let out a short, cynical laugh that held zero humor. "Congratulations," she said, pressing the button for the service elevator. The button glowed a dull red. "Want a medal? Or do you want me to mop up your tears?" "I want your name," Leo said. The bluntness of the statement seemed to physically hit her. She stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. She turned her head slowly, looking at him with a mixture of disbelief and deep, profound caution. "Why?" she asked. The bravado was gone from her voice, replaced by a cold, hard edge. Leo swallowed. The truth was absurd. The truth was that he had spent 10 minutes with a woman wearing diamonds and felt nothing but a hollow void. But the sight of her cracked knuckles scrubbing a floor made him want to burn the entire restaurant to the ground. "Because," Leo started, his voice rough, fracturing on the word. He struggled to find a lie that sounded plausible. He gave up. "Because I need to know it. The heavy metal doors of the service elevator groaned open behind her, revealing a hollow, scuffed interior. Karis looked at him for a long, agonizing moment. She stepped backward into the elevator. The mechanical doors began to slide shut. "It's Karis," she said, just as the gap narrowed. "Now go back to your own world, suit." The doors clanged shut with a loud, metallic boom, vibrating the floor beneath Leo's feet. He stood alone in the cold loading bay, staring at the closed elevator. The smell of cheap lemon bleach still lingered in his nose. "Karis," Leo murmured to the empty air. He pulled his hands out of his pockets, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. It rang once before Tommy answered, frantic. "Leo, talk to me. Is she a Fed? Is she carrying a wire? Did you abort?" "She's fine, Tommy," Leo said, his eyes still locked on the scuffed metal doors. "But you're never going to see her again." "What? Why?" Leo turned around, walking back toward the kitchen, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete. The cynical, exhausted mob boss who had walked into the restaurant an hour ago was dead. Something infinitely more dangerous had taken his place. "Because I quit," Leo said, hanging up the phone. "Subway trains at 2 a.m. do not hum. They scream. Metal grinds against rusted tracks with a high-pitched, agonizing shriek that vibrates straight through the cheap plastic seats and into Karis's exhausted bones." She sat in the corner of the empty car, her olive-green parka pulled tightly around her chest, staring blankly at the flickering fluorescent advertisement for a personal injury lawyer across from her. The air in the subway car was heavy, smelling sharply of ozone, stale malt liquor, and the damp, decaying scent of wet garbage. Karis inhaled it without reacting. It was the perfume of her reality. She looked down at her hands. They were resting in her lap, fingers curled slightly inward to protect the raw, cracked skin of her knuckles. The cheap lotion she kept in her locker at Laurel hadn't done anything to soothe the chemical burn of the ammonia. It just made her skin feel greasy and tight. Her mind, stubbornly and infuriatingly, dragged her back to the hallway, to the massive, brooding man in the $5,000 suit crouching next to her dirty mop water. Karis squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands against her temples. She was too tired for hallucinations and too cynical for fairy tales. Men like him, men who wore bespoke wool and smelled of cedarwood and dangerous, quiet authority, did not notice women like her. If they did, it was a game. A momentary distraction from their caviar and their vapid, diamond-draped dates. He probably found her pathetic, a smudge on his pristine, curated evening. Yet he had walked away from his table. He had followed her to the loading dock. "Because I need to know it." The raw, fractured way he had spoken those words sent a weird, uncomfortable spike of adrenaline through her chest. It wasn't romantic. It was terrifying. Karis's entire existence was currently built on flying under the radar, surviving one minimum wage paycheck to the next, and making herself as invisible as possible. Men who looked at you like you were the only oxygen in the room were men who eventually suffocated you. The train lurched to a violent stop, throwing her slightly forward. The automated voice announced her station, a decaying stop in a neighborhood where the streetlights were mostly decorative. Karis walked the 4 blocks to her apartment, briskly, her keys threaded defensively between her fingers. The wind whipped down the narrow street, biting through her thin coat. She pushed open the heavy glass door of her building, ignoring the jagged crack in the pane that had been there since November, and began the 5-flight climb. Her apartment was a shoebox of peeling linoleum and rattling pipes. The lock stuck, requiring a brutal jiggle of the key and a hard shove with her shoulder to finally give way. She stepped inside. The air was freezing. The radiator in the corner was currently deciding to act as a decorative piece of rusted metal rather than a heat source. Karis didn't even bother turning on the main overhead light. It emitted an aggressive, buzzing yellow glare that gave her migraines. She flipped on the small, thrift store lamp by the cramped kitchenette. A red light was blinking on her answering machine. Karis froze, her coat half off her shoulders. That red light was a physical weight dropping into her stomach. Nobody called her landline, nobody except collection agencies, and him. She walked over, her boots sticking slightly to the tacky linoleum, and pressed play. The machine whirred, a harsh mechanical noise in the quiet room. Karis. The voice was rushed, thick with panic and the wet, sloppy sound of a bad cold or withdrawal. Karis, it's Dom. Look, I know you said not to call here, but I'm in a bind, okay? A real bad one. Frankie found out where I'm staying. He says the grace period is over. He said he knows where you work now. I'm sorry, Karis, I'm so sorry. I'll fix this, I promise. Just keep your head down. The machine clicked off. Karis stood perfectly still in the dim room. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dominic, her older brother, the man who had forged her signature as a guarantor on a $30,000 loan to a neighborhood bookie 3 years ago to fund a gambling habit he swore was under control. $30,000. To Karis, making $14 an hour scrubbing up spilled wine, it might as well have been 30 million. Frankie Russo wasn't a bank. He didn't send sternly worded letters on heavy cardstock. Frankie sent men with brass knuckles who waited in the alleys behind restaurants. A cold sweat broke out across the back of her neck, completely at odds with the freezing temperature of the apartment. She walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and splashed freezing water over her face. The shock of it forced a gasp from her lungs. She looked up, staring at her pale, terrified reflection in the spotted mirror above the sink. "Keep your head down," Dom had said. She had been keeping her head down for 3 years. She had scrubbed floors, cleaned toilets, and lived on ramen and day-old bread, sacrificing every shred of her youth to slowly chip away at a debt she didn't owe. And it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Suddenly, the image of the man in the suit flashed through her mind again. The dark, heavy eyes, the broad, immovable shoulders. A hysterical, dark bubble of laughter climbed up her throat. She had been worried about a rich guy playing games, completely forgetting that the real monsters were already at her door. Diesel fumes and rotting kelp hung thick in the air. The midnight fog rolling off the harbor was cold and wet, sticking to the shipping containers like a greasy film. Leo stood by the edge of the pier, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a heavy black overcoat. He watched passively as 4 of his men loaded unmarked wooden crates from a rusted trawler into the back of 2 reinforced delivery trucks. Assault rifles. Check-made, clean, untraceable, and highly lucrative. Beside him, Benny, a stocky, prematurely balding lieutenant who breathed heavily through his mouth, was running down the logistics on a clipboard. "So we shift the manifest to Dock 4, bribe the morning inspector, and the trucks are in Jersey by sunrise," Benny finished, tapping a thick pen against the paper. "Smooth as glass, boss." "Fine," Leo said. His voice was a flat, gravelly rumble. He wasn't looking at the trucks. He was staring at the black, churning water sloshing against the wooden pylons. Benny hesitated, shifting his weight. "You all right, Leo? You've been staring at that water for 10 minutes. You want I should have Sal bring the car around?" Leo finally pulled his gaze away from the harbor. He looked at Benny. "You got that file I asked for?" Benny blinked, surprised by the pivot. He reached inside his leather jacket and pulled out a thin manila folder, slightly crumpled at the edges. "Yeah, Had to wake up a contact at the DMV, but I got it. Caris Torres, 26, lives in a dump over in Queens, works a double shift at L'Oreal, and picks up weekends at a laundromat. Leo took the folder. The paper felt rough against his calloused fingertips. He opened it under the harsh, sickly orange glow of a nearby sodium streetlight. There was a low-quality printout of her driver's license photo. Even in the grainy black and white ink, she looked exhausted. Her jaw was set in that same defensive, rigid line he had seen in the restaurant hallway. "She got family?" Leo asked, his eyes scanning the sparse lines of text. Benny scratched the back of his neck, a telltale sign he was about to deliver bad news. "Parents are dead. Car wreck when she was 19. Left her with a mountain of medical debt she just finished paying off last year. But," Benny paused, "she's got an older brother. Dominic." Leo's eyes snapped up from the paper. "What about him?" "He's a ghost. Addict, mostly. But he's a loud ghost. Racked up a massive tab with Frankie Teeth Russo down in Little Italy. $30K. Put his sister's name on the paper." Benny grimaced. "Frankie's been squeezing her for the interest. Rumor is Frankie's out of patience. He's sending a couple of heavy hands to visit her at work this week to make a point." The air around Leo seemed to drop 10 degrees. The rhythmic sloshing of the water against the pier faded into static. Frankie Russo, a bottom-feeding, loud-mouthed loan shark who operated out of a damp basement club. A man who dealt in fear and broken kneecaps. Leo closed the manila folder. The snap of the cardboard was loud in the quiet night. "Get the car." "Jersey?" Benny asked, already turning toward the idling sedan. "No," Leo said, his voice dropping into a deadly, frictionless whisper. Little Italy. 30 minutes later, the black sedan pulled up to the curb outside the Velvet Room, a dilapidated social club squeezed between a struggling bakery and a pawn shop. The neon sign above the door flickered, casting erratic pink shadows onto the wet pavement. It smelled of stale beer, cheap cigars, and desperation. Leo didn't wait for Benny to open his door. He shoved it open and stepped out into the night, his heavy boots hitting the asphalt with terrifying purpose. He didn't bring backup. He didn't need it. He pushed through the front doors. The club was practically empty, save for 2 massive bouncers playing cards at a corner table and a bored bartender polishing a glass. The air was thick with smoke. The bouncers looked up, ready to bark an order to leave. Then they recognized the face. They recognized the broad shoulders, the broken nose, and the dead, shark-like emptiness in Leo Castiglione's eyes. The blood drained from both their faces simultaneously. They slowly put their hands on the table, palms up. "Where is he?" Leo asked. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. "Back office, Mr. Castiglione," one of the men stuttered, gesturing weakly toward a heavily padded leather door behind the bar. Leo walked past them. The silence in his wake was absolute. He kicked the padded leather door open. The lock splintered with a sharp crack, the door flying inward and slamming against the wood-paneled wall. Frankie Russo, a greasy man in a shiny tracksuit, jumped up from his desk, knocking over a half-empty glass of scotch. "What the hell, Leo? Boss? What are you doing here?" Leo stepped into the small, claustrophobic office. It smelled intensely of cheap cologne and sweat. He walked directly to the desk. He didn't sit down. He loomed over the smaller man, casting a massive, terrifying shadow. "Caris Torres," Leo said. The name tasted strange in this filthy room. It felt like dropping a piece of fine silk into a mud puddle. Frankie blinked, his beady eyes darting around the room as if looking for a translation. "Who? The cleaning girl? What about her?" "Her brother owes you 30,000, Leo stated. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Frankie said, a nervous, oily smile stretching across his face. Yeah, Dominic. Piece of garbage. But the sister, she's paying the vig. I mean, I gotta squeeze her a little. You know how it is. Leo moved faster than a man his size had any right to. His massive hand shot out, grabbing a heavy crystal ashtray from the corner of the desk. In one fluid, brutal motion, he slammed it down onto the desk, missing Frankie's left hand by a millimeter. The impact shattered the heavy crystal into a dozen jagged pieces, sending shards flying across the room and gouging a deep trench into the mahogany wood. Frankie shrieked, falling backward into his leather chair, clutching his hand to his chest as if it had been severed. Leo leaned over the desk, planting both his hands flat on the wood. He brought his face mere inches from Frankie's sweating, terrified forehead. "The debt is cleared," Leo whispered. His voice was a physical pressure in the room. "You're going to take Dominic Torres's paper, and you are going to burn it. If you ever say her name again, if you ever look at a restaurant she works in, if you ever send a man within a 10-block radius of her apartment in Queens, I won't use an ashtray. Do we understand each other, Frankie?" Frankie was trembling violently, his eyes fixed on the massive gouge in his desk. Yes, Mr. Castiglione. Cleared. It's done. I swear to God, it's done." Leo stared at him for 3 long seconds, ensuring the terror was deeply rooted in the man's marrow. Then he stood up. He adjusted the cuffs of his overcoat, a purely mechanical gesture, and turned around. He walked out of the club, leaving the door hanging off its hinges. When he stepped back out into the cold night air, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a hollow, sickening ache. He looked down at his right hand. A small shard of crystal from the ashtray had nicked his knuckle. A single drop of blood welled up, bright and red against his skin. He pulled out a pristine white handkerchief and wiped the blood away, staring at the smeared red stain on the cotton. He had fixed her problem. He had protected her. But as he looked at the blood on his hands and smelled the lingering scent of Frankie's cheap cigar smoke on his clothes, the cynical reality of his existence crashed down on him. Caris Torres was a woman who scrubbed dirty floors to survive in a harsh world. She was honest. She was real. And Leo was just the monster who had bruised his knuckles in the dark to keep her safe. He had wanted to approach her, to strip away the exhaustion from her hazel eyes. But standing here on the wet pavement, surrounded by the violent machinery of his own life, he realized a crushing truth. He couldn't bring her into his world without dirtying her. And she would never let a monster into hers. Tuesday morning tasted like burnt coffee and lingering paranoia. Caris sat on a cracked plastic chair inside Wash and Dry, a 24-hour laundromat that smelled eternally of synthetic mountain breeze detergent and wet lint. The rhythmic thumping of an unbalanced dryer in the corner usually served as white noise, numbing her exhausted brain. Today it sounded like a countdown. She stared at the prepaid cell phone resting on her lap. 10 minutes ago, Dominic had called. He had been crying, ugly, wet, confusing tears. He tore up the paper, Caris. Frankie just tore it up. Said we're square. Said to forget he ever existed. Caris hadn't felt the crushing weight of relief that her brother seemed to be experiencing. She felt the bottom of her stomach drop into an icy void. Men like Frankie Russo did not experience sudden, philanthropic awakenings. They didn't write off $30,000 debts because of a change of heart. They were forced, and they were only forced by men who cast bigger, darker, more violent shadows. Her mind snapped back to the loading dock, to the massive man in the expensive bespoke suit. Because I need to know it. She rubbed her calloused thumbs over the scratched screen of the cheap phone. He hadn't asked for her number. He hadn't asked for a date. He just wanted a name. A name was a thread. If you pull the right thread in this city, you can unravel a person's entire life. Karis stood up abruptly, the plastic chair scraping loudly against the cheap linoleum floor. She grabbed a damp rag and a bottle of generic glass cleaner from her supply cart, marching toward the front windows. She sprayed the glass with aggressive, rapid pumps. The blue liquid dripped down the pane, distorting the view of the grey street outside. She scrubbed the glass, leaning her entire body weight into the motion. She was angry. A hot, suffocating anger that tasted like copper in the back of her mouth. She had spent 3 years paying a blood tax, sacrificing her own youth to keep her brother breathing. It was miserable, it was unfair, but it was hers. She knew the rules. She knew the mechanics of her suffering. This new reality had no rules. A stranger, a predator wrapped in high-end wool, had casually stepped into her nightmare and deleted it with a snap of his fingers. What did a man like that want in return? You don't wipe out a $30,000 debt for a stranger you watched scrub a wine stain. You buy a debt like that to own the debtor. Across the street, parked halfway in a loading zone, a black sedan sat idling. Its windows were heavily tinted, reflecting the overcast sky like flat mirrors. Inside the heavily armored car, Leo watched the furious, jerky movements of the woman behind the laundromat glass. The blue spray, the ragged cloth, the rigid line of her shoulders. He had been parked there for an hour, telling himself he was just making sure Frankie hadn't been stupid enough to retaliate. It was a lie. A flimsy, pathetic lie. "Boss," Benny said softly from the driver's seat. He didn't turn around. He just kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the leather steering wheel. "We got the sit-down with the Calabrese family in an hour. Traffic on the bridge is backing up." Leo didn't answer. His eyes were locked on Karis. She was wearing a faded grey sweatshirt today, the sleeves pushed up past her elbows, revealing the pale, bruised-looking skin of her forearms. Even through the distorted, streaky glass, he could see the tension radiating off her. He had fixed the problem. He had silenced the monster at her door. But looking at her now, attacking the window with a rag like it was a physical enemy, he didn't see a woman who felt safe. He saw a woman who realized she was no longer at the bottom of the food chain, but trapped in a cage with a much larger, completely unknown apex predator. "Drive," Leo finally murmured, his voice sounding entirely too hollow in the quiet cabin of the sedan. Benny shifted the car into gear. The heavy vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging into the sluggish city traffic. Leo didn't look back. He couldn't. The smell of synthetic laundry detergent and wet concrete seemed to cling to the interior of the car, entirely overpowering the scent of rich leather and his own expensive cologne. He was the head of the Castiglione family. He controlled docks, warehouses, politicians, and hundreds of men who would take a bullet for him without hesitation. Yet, he felt entirely, hopelessly out of his depth. He had bought her safety, but he had entirely compromised her peace. He had to fix it. But he knew, with a sick, sinking certainty, that stepping into that laundromat to explain himself would only terrify her more. Thursday evening brought a bitter, biting wind that whipped trash down the gutters and made the neon signs of the city buzz with an angry electrical hum. Karis finished her shift at L'Oreal early. The restaurant was surprisingly dead, allowing the manager to cut the cleaning crew loose an hour ahead of schedule. She should have been grateful for the extra hour of sleep. Instead, she felt entirely exposed. Walking out the service doors and into the alleyway felt like stepping onto a stage under a sniper's scope. Every idling car, every shadow stretching across the damp brick, made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She pulled her olive-green parka tight, ducking her head against the wind, and began the walk toward the subway. She barely made it to the end of the block. He was leaning against a brick wall under a busted streetlight. Leo wasn't wearing a suit tonight. He wore dark jeans, heavy work boots, and a thick black peacoat with the collar turned up against the cold. He didn't look like a high society imposter anymore. He looked exactly like what he was, a massive, hardened man who belonged to the concrete and the shadows. Karis stopped dead in her tracks. Her chest tightened so fast she physically gasped, a short, sharp intake of freezing air. Leo pushed off the wall. He didn't make a sudden move toward her. He just stood there, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. The orange glow of a nearby bodega sign caught the sharp angles of his broken nose, and the deep, permanent exhaustion etched around his dark eyes. "I'm not following you," Leo said. His voice was a low, rough rumble that fought against the sound of the wind. "I knew what time your shift ended. I waited here." Karis's knuckles went white as she gripped the strap of her cheap canvas bag. "That is the exact definition of following me." Leo winced, a microscopic flinch that most people would have missed. "I suppose it is." Karis didn't run. She was tired of running. She was tired of being afraid of loan sharks, and tired of being afraid of the giant man standing 10 feet away from her. The boiling anger she had been carrying since Dominic's phone call spiked, completely overriding her survival instincts. She marched toward him. The soles of her cheap boots slapped aggressively against the pavement. She stopped a mere 3 feet away, tipping her head back to glare up into his face. He was huge up close, an immovable wall of muscle and heavy wool. He smelled of cold air, tobacco, and something dark and earthy. "How much?" Karis demanded. Her voice didn't shake. It was a raspy, furious whisper. Leo frowned, his heavy brows pulling together. "What?" "Don't play stupid with me," Karis snapped, jabbing a cracked red index finger toward his chest. She didn't actually touch his coat. Some buried instinct kept her hand an inch away from the thick wool. But the intention was clear. Frankie Russo didn't just wake up and find Jesus. Dominic's debt is gone, and you are the only variable that changed. So I'm asking you, how much do I owe you? Leo stared down at her. He saw the fire in her hazel eyes, the defensive, rigid set of her jaw. She wasn't thanking him. She was bracing for the collection. The realization felt like a physical blow to his ribs. "Nothing," Leo said quietly. Karis let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like tearing paper. "Right. The fairy godfather of the service industry. You just casually dropped 30 grand because you felt bad I was scrubbing up a wine stain? Please. Men like you don't do favors. Men like you buy things. So tell me what you bought." Leo's hands flexed inside his pockets. He wanted to reach out, to grab her shoulders and shake the cynicism out of her. But he knew he was the one who had put it there. Or at least, men who looked and acted just like him. "I didn't buy you," Leo said. His voice dropped an octave, losing its gravelly edge, becoming dangerously soft. "I didn't pay him a dime." Karis froze. The bitter laugh died in her throat. She looked at his face, really looked at it. She looked at the scars on his chin, the flat, deadened calm in his eyes that only came from immense violence. The pieces clicked together with a horrifying, icy clarity. He hadn't paid Frankie. He had threatened him. Or worse. "Who are you?" Karis whispered. The anger was draining out of her, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that settled heavy in her stomach. "My name is Leo," he said. He didn't offer a last name. He couldn't stomach the look of absolute terror he knew would follow it. "And you don't owe me anything. Not money, not time, not gratitude." "Then why?" she pushed, her voice cracking. "Why do this? You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." Leo looked down at her hands. She was clutching her bag so tightly the cracked skin over her knuckles looked ready to split. He thought about his own life. The endless meetings in smoke-filled rooms, the calculated betrayals, the blood on the warehouse floors. He existed in a world entirely composed of lies and leverage, and then there was Karis, sitting on her hands and knees, smelling of industrial bleach, looking up at him with pure, unfiltered annoyance because he was standing too close to her dirty mop water. She was the most honest thing he had seen in 15 years. "Because I wanted you to sleep," Leo said. The admission felt incredibly raw, like peeling a bandage off an open wound. Karis blinked, entirely thrown by the answer. "What?" "When I looked at you," Leo continued, his dark eyes locking onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "You looked like a woman who hasn't had a full night of sleep in 3 years. I have a lot of resources. Fixing your brother's mistake cost me exactly 10 minutes of my time. It was nothing to me. But it was everything to you." He finally pulled his hands out of his pockets. He didn't reach for her. He just let them hang at his sides, open and empty. "You were drowning," Leo said, his voice stripped of all its commanding authority, leaving behind only a quiet, grounded truth. "I just pulled you onto the dock. That's it. There's no trap door. There's no invoice." Karis stared at him. The cold wind howled down the alley, whipping her dull brown hair across her face. She was searching his eyes for the lie. For the catch. It was practically hardwired into her DNA to find the hidden angle, but the massive, terrifying man standing in front of her didn't look like he was running a con. He looked deeply, completely exhausted. Just like her. "You're a criminal," Karis said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Leo didn't flinch. He didn't try to sugarcoat it. "Yes. You hurt people. Only the ones who deserve it." Karis shook her head, a slow, disbelieving motion. "Nobody is that simple." "I never said I was simple," Leo replied, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a ghost of a sad smile. "I said you don't owe me." He took a half step back, putting more physical distance between them, giving her the oxygen she clearly needed. "Go home, Karis," Leo told her gently. "Lock your door. Turn off your alarm clock. Sleep. That's the only thing I want from you." He turned around, the heavy wool of his coat sweeping in the wind, and began to walk away down the dark alley. Karis stood frozen on the sidewalk. She watched his broad back recede into the shadows. Her mind was screaming at her to run to the subway, to disappear into the crowd, to accept the miracle and never look a gift horse in the mouth. But as she watched the darkness start to swallow him whole, a terrifying, entirely irrational thought pierced through her panic. He had pulled her out of the drowning water. Yes, but looking at him walking away, completely alone in the freezing wind, she realized something else. He was drowning, too. 4 days passed. Silence felt entirely different when it wasn't fueled by impending doom. Karis slept for 14 hours straight that first night, collapsing onto her lumpy mattress without taking off her jeans. When she woke up, the crushing, suffocating weight that had sat on her chest for 3 years was gone. But the absence of panic didn't leave her feeling light. It left a strange, echoing hollow in her ribs. She kept waiting for the catch. She checked her bank account, expecting it to be drained. She walked past the alleyway behind the restaurant, her muscles locked tight, anticipating one of Frankie's goons to step out from the shadows with a baseball bat and a grin. Nothing happened. The air was clear. The debt was dead. And Leo was a ghost. Friday night brought a sharp, sleeting drizzle that coated the city sidewalks in a treacherous layer of black ice. Karis pushed through the heavy glass doors of L'Oreal, pulling her olive-green parka tight against her throat. The cold bit immediately, stinging her cheeks. She put her head down, plotting the quickest route to the subway, when she saw it. Parked illegally directly under a flickering street lamp was a heavy black sedan. The engine was running, emitting a low, powerful purr that vibrated through the slushy pavement. The windows were heavily tinted, black and reflective. Karis stopped. The biting wind whipped her damp hair across her face. She should keep walking. She should get on the train, go to her freezing apartment, and accept the bizarre miracle she had been handed. She was free. A man who lived in a violent, bloody world had bought her freedom and walked away, asking for absolutely nothing. Going to that car was willingly stepping into a cage. Her boots turned off the sidewalk and headed straight for the bodega on the corner. She walked inside. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, completely at odds with the smell of stale beer and overripe plantains. She walked to the back, poured 2 cups of the burnt, sludgy coffee sitting on the heating pad, and paid the cashier $3. The thin paper cups burned her palms, offering a sharp, physical pain that grounded her racing thoughts. She walked back out into the sleet. She marched directly to the black sedan. She didn't hesitate. She didn't give her survival instincts time to kick in. She raised her foot and gave the heavy, armored tire a solid kick with her cheap boot. 10 seconds passed. The engine continued its low hum. Then the passenger side window rolled down. It didn't squeak. It glided silently into the doorframe, letting out a rush of warm air that smelled intensely of expensive leather, cedarwood, and copper. Leo was sitting in the driver's seat. The breath caught in Karis's throat, getting trapped somewhere behind her tonsils. He looked terrible. He was wearing a charcoal grey sweater, but the collar was pulled out of shape. His face, the sharp, brutal architecture that had intimidated her a week ago, was a mess of purple and yellow swelling. A jagged, angry cut sat high on his cheekbone, sealed shut with 3 neat, surgical butterfly bandages. His lower lip was split, a dark scab forming on the corner. He didn't look like an untouchable mob boss. He looked like a man who had lost a fight with a freight train. "You shouldn't be near this car," Leo said. His voice was rougher than usual, grating against his vocal cords. He kept his hands draped loosely over the steering wheel, his knuckles swollen and raw. "Unlock the door," Karis demanded. Her voice didn't waver. Leo slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locked onto hers, heavily shadowed by exhaustion. "Karis, go home. Unlock it, or I'm pouring this scalding, terrible coffee all over your leather seats, through the window." Leo stared at her. A muscle ticked in his unbruised cheek. The sheer, irrational defiance radiating off the small woman standing in the freezing sleet was completely baffling. He reached over and hit a button on the console. The heavy locks clicked upward with a sharp, mechanical thud. Karis opened the heavy door and slid into the passenger seat. She pulled the door shut behind her, instantly cutting off the sound of the sleet and the wind. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. It was a vault. She held out one of the flimsy paper cups. Leo looked at the cup, then up at her face. He didn't take it. "What are you doing, Karis? You said I didn't owe you anything," Karis replied, keeping the cup suspended between them. "You didn't say anything about me buying you a terrible coffee. Take it. It's burning my fingers." Leo finally reached out. His massive hand engulfed the small cup. His fingers brushed against hers, briefly, accidentally, and the contact felt like a static shock. His skin was incredibly warm, feverish. "You look like hell," she observed quietly, staring at the butterfly bandages on his cheek. Leo let out a dry, humorless exhale. He took a sip of the coffee and instantly grimaced at the bitter, burnt taste. But he didn't put it down. A business meeting in Queens required a physical renegotiation. It's fine. That doesn't look fine, Karis countered. She felt a strange, tight, pulling sensation in her chest. She had spent her entire adult life terrified of violent men. Dom's bookies, Frankie's collectors, men who used pain as currency. Leo was one of them. He was likely the king of them. Yet, sitting here in the quiet warmth of his car, looking at the damage inflicted on him, she didn't feel fear. She felt an overwhelming, furious urge to clean the dried blood off his collar. "Why are you here, Karis?" Leo asked. He leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes. The bruising around his temple was turning a sickly shade of green in the ambient streetlight. "I cleared your ledger. You're out. You don't ever have to look over your shoulder again. Don't come looking for the dark. It stains." "I work in sanitation, Leo," Karis said dryly. "I scrub human vomit out of grout for $14 an hour. My brother stole my identity to buy pills and blackjack hands. My entire life is a stain. Don't put me on a pedestal. I don't belong there, and I don't want to be there." Leo opened his eyes, turning his head to look at her. The raw honesty in her voice stripped away the practiced, guarded layers he used to navigate his empire. "My world isn't just dirty, Karis," Leo said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. He needed her to understand. He needed to scare her away before his own selfish desires ruined her entirely. "It's lethal. The men I deal with don't send collection notices. They put people in the ground. The blood on my face isn't a metaphor. I hurt people. I break them. If you stay in this car, if you look at me for 1 second longer than you have to, you become a target. You become leverage." Karis looked at his split lip. She looked at his swollen knuckles, clutching the cheap paper cup. She reached into her parka pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled napkin she had grabbed from the bodega. She unscrewed the cap of her plastic water bottle, tipped a few drops onto the cheap paper, and leaned across the center console. Leo flinched backward as she reached for his face, a purely instinctual reaction born of paranoia. "Hold still, you idiot," Karis muttered. She pressed the damp napkin against his jawline, right where a smear of dried blood had cracked and flaked into his stubble. She didn't wipe it gently. She rubbed at it with the same firm, utilitarian pressure she used to clean a stubborn counterstain. Leo froze. His entire massive frame went completely rigid. He stopped breathing. The sensation of her cold, calloused fingers gripping his chin, anchoring him in place while she scrubbed his skin, sent a jolt of pure, terrifying electricity straight down his spine. Nobody touched him like this. Nobody touched him without an angle, without fear, or without a weapon. "I know what you are," Karis said quietly, her eyes focused intensely on the smear of blood. "I'm not stupid. I didn't get into this car thinking you were an import-export guy with a bad temper." "Then why did you get in?" Leo whispered. He didn't dare move. He felt if he breathed too deeply, she would vanish, evaporating back into the cold sleet. "Because..." Karis stopped rubbing the stain. She didn't pull her hand away. Her thumb rested against the rough, bruised skin of his jaw. She finally looked up, meeting his heavy, dark eyes. "When you walked away in that alley, you looked worse than my brother did when he hit rock bottom. You looked completely empty." Leo's throat worked as he swallowed heavily. The burnt coffee tasted like ash in his mouth. He reached up, his large, battered hand wrapping gently around her wrist. He didn't pull her hand away from his face. He just held it there, anchoring himself to her touch. "I've been empty for a very long time," he admitted, the words feeling jagged and sharp on his tongue. "And I've been terrified for a very long time," Karis replied, her voice softening, losing its defensive edge. "I spent 3 years hiding, making myself as small as possible so the monsters wouldn't notice me. Then a bigger monster came along and chased them all away." She let out a small, breathy laugh that held absolutely no humor. "But you aren't scary to me," she continued, her thumb tracing the edge of his jawline. "You're just tired, and you're bleeding, and you drink terrible coffee." Leo closed his eyes, leaning his heavy head into her palm. The absolute, undeniable trust in that simple motion broke something deep inside Karis. It wasn't a heroic gesture. It was a surrender, a brutal, violent man laying down his armor in the front seat of a running car. "I can't protect you from everything," Leo murmured, his voice thick. "If you stay near me, the peace I bought you is gone. My life doesn't stop. I don't need absolute peace," Karis said firmly. She shifted her weight, pulling her hand back to rest in her own lap. The loss of contact made the cold air in the car suddenly noticeable again. "I just need honesty. I can handle the dirt. I can handle the mess. I've been cleaning up messes my entire life. Just don't lie to me." Leo opened his eyes. The deadened, shark-like emptiness that usually resided there was completely gone, replaced by a fierce, undeniable clarity. He looked at her battered boots, her cheap olive parka, and the raw red skin of her knuckles. She wasn't high society. She wasn't a diamond-draped illusion. She was concrete. She was the anchor he didn't know he was desperate for. He reached across the console, moving slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to pull away. He didn't grab her. He just rested his large, bruised hand over hers. His palm was calloused and rough. Karis didn't flinch. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. They didn't kiss. They didn't fall into a passionate, cinematic embrace. They just sat there in the idling car, holding hands like two survivors in a lifeboat. Outside the tinted glass, the sleet continued to pound against the city pavement, turning the neon lights into a blurry, chaotic mess. The world outside was loud, dangerous, and entirely unforgiving. But inside the car, the scent of cheap bodega coffee mixed perfectly with the smell of expensive leather. Leo put the car in drive. The heavy sedan pulled away from the curb, leaving the restaurant, the spilled wine, and the ghosts of the alley behind. They didn't know exactly where they were going, but as Leo's thumb gently stroked the cracked skin of Karis's knuckles, they both finally knew they weren't drowning anymore. If you enjoyed this raw, grounded journey of survival and unexpected connection in the shadows of the city, hit that like button to let me know. Stories like Leo and Karis's remind us that sometimes the most profound love isn't found in perfect, shiny moments, but in the gritty, exhausting reality of everyday life. Don't forget to share this audio with a friend who loves a deeply emotional, cynical romance, and absolutely hit subscribe to catch the next gritty storytelling video. Your support keeps these stories alive. Drop a comment below. Would you have gotten into the car?